The corner of hope. As Darius stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind raced with confusion. How had he ended up in this moment? Just a few minutes ago, he had been standing at the corner of the street, selling his lemonade, trying to make enough to buy some groceries for his grandmother. And now, here he was, standing face to face with a man who had a car worth more than Darius' whole neighborhood, with a daughter who looked like she stepped out of a storybook. His chest tightened, a mix of excitement and disbelief threatening to overtake him. The man's face softened, his eyes reflecting the depth of his gratitude, but there was something else there, something Darius couldn't quite place. For a brief moment, the man seemed to hesitate, as if he were unsure of how to approach the situation. His hand reached up and wiped his forehead, a subtle sign of the pressure that had mounted on him in the few seconds since the emergency had passed. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice suddenly quieter, more concerned. You did something extraordinary back there." Darius just nodded, still catching his breath, not entirely sure how to respond. He wasn't looking for praise or accolades. He had simply done what anyone would have done in the moment, he had reacted. But he could feel the weight of the man's words. There was more in them than mere gratitude. Something about Darius' simplicity and his calmness in a situation so overwhelming had left an impression on the man. The girl in the passenger seat was now sitting up straighter, her hand resting gently on her throat. She was breathing steadily, but her face was pale, the shock still written across her features. She stared at Darius, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice shaky. I thought I was going to die." Darius offered her a small, reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He didn't need thanks. What mattered to him, what had always mattered to him, was keeping his promise to his grandmother. She was the reason he was out here in the heat, the reason he sacrificed so much. She had given him everything when he had nothing, and he would do whatever it took to make sure she didn't suffer. The man turned to his daughter, his expression darkening with concern. His voice softened. "Are you sure you're okay, sweetheart?" The girl nodded slowly, still shaken, but trying to steady herself. "I'm fine, Dad. It's just, that was really scary." She looked back at Darius again, her gaze filled with gratitude. "I don't even know what to say. You saved my life." Darius wasn't sure what to say either. The words felt heavy in his mouth. What did you say to someone who had nearly lost their life, and someone who was offering you something in return? Darius didn't need anything from them. His world was small, and he had learned long ago that kindness and love were worth far more than anything money could provide. The man's eyes flickered toward Darius, and he seemed to wrestle with something in his mind. His posture shifted slightly, the tension in his shoulders relaxing as he exhaled. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low and sincere. "What do you want, son?" he asked, his gaze intent. "You saved her life. If there's anything you need, anything at all, I want to make sure you get it." Darius hesitated. The world had always taught him to keep his head down, to remain small in the face of overwhelming wealth and power. The man in front of him was everything Darius wasn't, rich, influential, surrounded by luxury that Darius couldn't even dream of. And yet, here he was, offering him something that many people would have gladly taken in a heartbeat: money, rewards, a chance to escape the struggle that weighed so heavily on Darius' shoulders. But Darius wasn't looking for a handout. He wasn't asking for something that could be bought or sold. His heart was heavy with a single, clear thought. The only thing he truly needed was for his grandmother to be well again. I need help with my grandmother's medicine," he said, his voice steady but quiet. He swallowed hard, trying to keep the emotion from cracking his voice. "She's sick, and we don't have enough money. She's the only family I have left. I need her to be okay." The man blinked, clearly caught off guard by the simplicity of the request. It wasn't what he had expected. Most people, when given the chance, asked for something big. Money, status, gifts. But Darius' request was pure, unselfish, so different from what the man had seen in the many years of his life. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The busy intersection, the traffic, the buzzing of life all around them, it all faded into the background. Darius felt a strange calm wash over him as he waited for the man's response. There was no impatience in his heart, no desperation. He had already asked for what he needed. It was now up to the man to decide whether he would make that promise, or whether Darius' hope would be dashed. The man glanced down at his daughter, then back at Darius, a deep sadness filling his eyes. He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, and for the first time since Darius had met him, the man looked unsure. His jaw clenched, and Darius could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes. The girl in the car, noticing her father's hesitation, spoke up softly. "Dad, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice a gentle nudge. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he seemed to sink into his thoughts, his brow furrowing. After a long silence, he turned back to Darius. "You're a good boy," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Your grandmother is lucky to have you." Darius' eyes widened, but he didn't say anything. He simply nodded, his heart thudding in his chest. He had asked for the one thing he truly needed, and now, it was in the hands of someone who had the means to help him. The man hesitated again, and this time, Darius noticed the faint shimmer of tears in the man's eyes. The girl watched, sensing the tension in the air. "I'll make sure she gets the help she needs," the man said, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "I'll take care of the bills, everything. Just, you take care of your grandmother, okay?" Darius nodded, his eyes filling with sudden warmth and relief. He felt a wave of gratitude, but also a deep sadness. His grandmother's face flashed in his mind, her frail form lying in the small apartment they called home. He would do anything for her. Anything. The man continued, his voice now thick with emotion. "Thank you, Darius. You've taught me something today, about what really matters. I'll never forget this." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the sound of a car honking in the distance pulled them all back to reality. Darius stood there, speechless but full of hope, knowing that this was a moment that would change his life forever, the promise. The intersection was a swirl of noise and heat, yet it seemed far away now. Darius stood frozen, his hands still gripping the sides of the tray, the bottles of lemonade and water long forgotten. The weight of the promise hung in the air, thick and heavy, like the humid summer heat. The car window rolled up slowly as the man reached to start the engine. He glanced at Darius one last time, his expression somber yet filled with an understanding Darius had never encountered before. "We'll take care of it," the man said softly, as the engine roared to life. "Just take care of your grandmother. We'll see you soon." The car sped off, merging with the traffic, leaving Darius standing in the sun, his heart still thumping wildly. It felt surreal. His whole life had just shifted, in ways he couldn't fully comprehend yet. The world had always felt small, confined to the space of his grandmother's apartment and the worn streets around it. But for the first time in his life, Darius felt a glimmer of possibility, like something bigger was waiting for him, waiting just beyond the next corner. The heat of the day seemed to press down harder as he finally turned away from the intersection. His feet moved slowly, almost mechanically, carrying him along the sidewalk toward his usual spot, his corner where he had spent hours standing, offering drinks to the passing crowd. But now, the weight of what had just happened pressed upon him, like a storm waiting to break. He could barely understand what had just transpired. The promise had been made. The rich man's offer had been accepted. It was as if the impossible had become real, and now there was no turning back. As Darius made his way back to the corner, the air around him seemed to change. It wasn't just the stifling heat or the exhaustion settling in his bones, it was something else. The world around him was beginning to look different. Even the buildings, the cracked sidewalks, and the littered streets seemed to hold new meaning. It was as if, somehow, everything had suddenly been imbued with a sense of purpose. His grandmother's face flashed in his mind, a reminder of why he had done what he did today. She was the reason he had acted. She was the reason he had made the request. It had been a simple request. A small one. But it felt like asking for the world. A life without worry, a life where the mounting burden of her sickness didn't weigh him down. Darius had always felt like the world was a cold place, one where people didn't care much about the struggles of those at the bottom. Yet here was a man, wealthy, powerful, who had promised to help. And not just in passing, not as a fleeting gesture. He had promised to change everything for Darius and his grandmother. But there was one thing Darius couldn't shake from his mind, the look in the man's eyes when he made the promise. It had been more than just the expression of a man keeping his word. It had been something deeper, something that lingered long after the car disappeared from view. It was almost like sorrow mixed with the unspoken recognition of a debt that couldn't truly be repaid. Darius wasn't sure why, but it made him uneasy. He arrived back at the small apartment, a tiny space tucked in the corner of a crumbling building, where the walls were thin and the ceilings low. The apartment was humble, just a single room with a worn couch, a small kitchen area, and a cluttered table where his grandmother spent most of her time resting. The place had always felt cramped, but it was home. It had to be enough. Darius stepped through the door, and the familiar smell of aging wood and medicine filled his nostrils. His grandmother was lying on the couch, a thin blanket covering her frail body. She was awake, her eyes half closed, looking out the window, her hands resting limply at her sides. She had always been so strong. When Darius was little, he remembered her laughing, bustling around the house, keeping him safe and loved. But now, she was a shadow of herself, constantly ill, her health declining with every passing month. The medications that kept her alive took up the majority of what little money they had. There were days when Darius couldn't bear the thought of watching her suffer any longer. But he always kept it to himself. He had to. For her. "Grandma," Darius called softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Her eyes fluttered open as she smiled faintly. "Darius," she said, her voice weak. "You're back early." He nodded, but his heart wasn't in the gesture. He didn't feel the usual warmth of relief when he saw her face. The weight of what had just happened outside felt like a heavy cloud pressing down on him. He had no idea how to explain to her what had just occurred. "Grandma, Darius hesitated, unsure of how to say it. The words tangled in his throat. She propped herself up on the couch, her hand reaching out for his. "What's wrong, my boy? You look like you've seen a ghost." Darius sat down next to her, his chest tight with emotion. He hadn't thought about how to tell her. He hadn't thought about the impact this promise would have on her, on their lives. I met someone today," Darius started slowly, his voice faltering. "I saved a girl's life. She was choking, and I helped her." His eyes dropped to the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "Her dad, he said he'd help us. He said he'd make sure we could pay for your medicine." His grandmother didn't speak immediately. She just stared at him, her wrinkled face unreadable. For a long moment, she simply studied him, her old eyes full of something Darius couldn't quite place. Her fingers curled around his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "You did a brave thing, my dear," she said finally, her voice low, almost as if she were considering her words carefully. "But nothing in this world is free. People don't give things away just to be kind, Darius. There's always a cost. Always." Her words hit Darius like a wave. He hadn't thought about the cost of the promise. He hadn't thought about the man's hidden intentions. All he had seen was the opportunity, the chance to lift his grandmother's suffering. And yet, his grandmother's words hung in the air like a warning. "Do you think it's too much to ask for, Grandma?" Darius asked, his voice small. "I just want you to be okay." She smiled softly, her eyes filled with love but also a deep, quiet wisdom. "Of course you want that, my boy. But remember, the world doesn't always give you what you want. Sometimes, the price is higher than you can imagine." Darius didn't know what to say. He hadn't even considered the cost of the promise. But now, as his grandmother's words echoed in his mind, he felt a gnawing fear creeping up inside of him. Was he wrong to accept the man's offer? Would it come with a price that he couldn't pay? The day had started so simple. A boy trying to survive in a world that overlooked him. And yet, now it felt like he was standing at the edge of something he didn't understand, something that would change everything. This continuation expands on Darius' feelings, the interaction with his grandmother, and the uncertainty surrounding the promise he accepted. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or adjust any aspect. The weight of promises. Days passed, and the promise that had been made lingered like a shadow, hanging over Darius and his grandmother. The summer heat continued to suffocate the city, but in the small apartment where Darius and his grandmother lived, there was no escaping the weight that had settled into the air. The moment of the rescue, the rush of adrenaline, the sense of purpose, felt like a distant memory, fading further with each passing day. The reality of what had been promised began to settle in, and Darius found himself wrestling with emotions he hadn't fully understood when he made the request. He had asked for something simple. Something that seemed, to him, as natural as breathing. His grandmother's health had been deteriorating for months, and the medications she needed were far beyond what they could afford. But now, as the days dragged on, Darius began to feel the pull of his grandmother's words. "Nothing in this world is free," she had said. "There's always a cost." That thought gnawed at him. Darius didn't know what the man would want in return. He hadn't thought about it that day. He had been focused on his grandmother, on the sickness that consumed her, and the weight of the promise that had been made to ease that burden. But now, each time he thought about the man, the father of the girl he had saved, his chest tightened with a mixture of hope and dread. The man had promised help, yes, but what did it truly mean? The next week, Darius waited. Each morning, he got up early, just like he always did. He helped his grandmother with her medications, did the small chores around the apartment, and sold lemonade on the corner. He told himself that everything was normal, that he didn't need to dwell on the promise made by a stranger. Yet, every time he looked out across the street, his eyes scanned the crowd of pedestrians, hoping to see the gleaming car pull up again. But nothing happened. Days turned into weeks, and with each day that passed without a visit, Darius began to feel a creeping anxiety. What if the man had forgotten? What if he had been offering empty promises, just another way of feeling good without ever actually following through? Darius couldn't bear the thought. He needed to believe. He had no choice but to hold on to the belief that the man would keep his word. Then, one day, when the sun was at its highest, casting long shadows down the street, the sleek car appeared again. Darius was sitting on the corner with his tray of drinks, watching the cars pass by. His gaze was distant, but when he saw the familiar car coming toward the intersection, his heart skipped a beat. The same car, the same man at the wheel, and the girl in the passenger seat. This time, Darius didn't even need to think. He stood up quickly, nearly knocking over his tray of lemonade as he rushed forward to meet them. His heart was racing now, and he could barely suppress the excitement that bubbled up inside of him. The car slowed as it approached, and the man rolled the window down once again, this time smiling warmly. "Darius," he said, his voice carrying a hint of relief. "We've been looking for you." Darius stopped in his tracks, a sudden rush of uncertainty flooding his chest. "Looking for me?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The man nodded, a serious expression replacing his previous warmth. Yes, we've been meaning to check in. Your grandmother, how is she? Is everything okay? Darius swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. She's okay. But, she still needs her medication. We're struggling, but we're getting by. The man studied him for a moment, then glanced over at the girl beside him. She was looking at Darius, her expression unreadable, though there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. I'm sorry to hear that, the man said, his tone softer now. We don't want to leave you in the dark, Darius. We've been making arrangements to help. Darius blinked, confused. Arrangements? The man nodded again, a slight frown pulling at his lips. I know you've been waiting for us. And I understand how hard it must be for you, trying to hold everything together. That's why we've set something up. Before Darius could ask what he meant, the man gestured to the back seat of the car. We've arranged for a nurse to visit your grandmother. She'll help with the medication and ensure that everything is taken care of. No more worrying about bills or not having enough. Darius felt the air leave his lungs as the words sunk in. A nurse. Someone to help. The weight that had been bearing down on his chest began to lift, replaced with a rush of relief. It was more than he had ever imagined. The man had kept his word. They were following through. But something in Darius' heart still felt unsettled. This kindness, this generosity, it was more than he had ever known. He didn't understand why someone who had so much would care so deeply about someone like him. But the thought of his grandmother, of her suffering, kept him grounded. This was a miracle. It had to be. Thank you, Darius said quietly, his voice trembling. He swallowed hard, his eyes downcast as a lump formed in his throat. You don't know what this means. The man smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression now. It's the least we could do. You saved my daughter's life, Darius. The least we can do is take care of the people who matter most to you. As he spoke, the girl in the passenger seat finally spoke up, her voice soft but clear. I'm really grateful, Darius, she said, meeting his eyes with a look that was part awe, part sadness. You really did save my life. I can't even imagine what that felt like for you. Darius didn't know what to say. He wasn't looking for thanks. He wasn't looking for anything except for his grandmother to be well again. But the way she said it, so gently, so sincerely. It made him feel as though he had done something far greater than he had ever thought possible. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Darius. This is for you, he said, his voice serious again. It's for your grandmother's care. The nurse will come every week, and this will cover her medication and the treatments she needs. I want you to use this, Darius. Take care of your grandmother. Darius took the envelope, his fingers shaking as he held it. Inside, there was enough money to cover everything, more than enough, in fact. It was a small fortune to someone like Darius. And yet, as he stared at the envelope in his hands, he couldn't help but feel that there was more to this story than he had yet uncovered. The promise had been kept, but at what cost? As the car drove off, Darius stood frozen for a long moment, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. The sounds of the street, the honking cars, the shuffling feet, seemed to blur together. For the first time in his life, he was unsure. The promise had been kept, but the weight of it pressed down on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. What was the cost of kindness? What would be expected of him, and what would be asked of his grandmother? Darius didn't know the answers yet. But as he turned and walked back into the apartment, he knew that his life, his grandmother's life, had just taken a turn. The question was no longer about what he had asked for, but about what he was willing to do to protect it, the unseen cost. The days following the promise felt like a whirlwind to Darius. Everything had shifted so suddenly, so dramatically, that at times, he found himself wondering if it had all been a dream. One moment, he was struggling to make ends meet, selling drinks on the street, feeling invisible, and the next, a stranger, a man with wealth and power, had shown up in his life, offering help in a way Darius had never imagined. But as the days wore on, the sense of disbelief began to fade. The nurse arrived the following week, just as the man had promised. She was kind and efficient, a professional who knew exactly how to care for his grandmother, ensuring her medications were administered on time and that she was more comfortable than Darius had seen her in months. The apartment, which had once felt like a prison of sickness and exhaustion, was now filled with the quiet hum of hope. The nurse would come 3 times a week, and each time, Darius could see the difference it made in his grandmother's spirit. She was eating more, sleeping more soundly, and her eyes no longer seemed to hold the same constant, weary pain. For the first time in as long as Darius could remember, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe things were going to get better. Maybe, for once, he wouldn't have to carry the burden alone. But as the nurse's visits became routine, something else began to gnaw at Darius. The feeling that had lingered when the man first made the promise, the strange unease, began to grow inside him. It wasn't just the fact that help had come so suddenly. It wasn't even the guilt that still occasionally crept up when he thought about how much he had asked for. No, it was something else, something deeper, a creeping suspicion that he couldn't shake. The man had helped, yes. But there was a price to be paid for everything, and Darius had learned early in life that nothing good came without a cost. He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't yet seen the full picture. It was one late afternoon, as Darius returned home from his corner, selling the last of his drinks for the day, that he found the first sign of what was to come. The door to their apartment was slightly ajar. That alone made Darius' heart skip a beat. His grandmother was always careful about keeping the door locked, especially since the neighborhood had grown rougher in recent years. Slowly, he pushed the door open, his pulse quickening as he stepped inside. The apartment was silent, but not in the comforting way it had been the past few days. It was a heavy silence, one that seemed to weigh down the air itself. His grandmother was sitting on the couch, but she wasn't alone. A man, a stranger, was standing by the window, his back to Darius. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and well-dressed in a suit that looked too expensive for this neighborhood. His voice was low and smooth, but the tone was sharp, like the edge of a blade. Darius froze in the doorway, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Don't worry, Mrs. Jenkins," the man said, his voice oozing with a false sense of comfort. "Everything is taken care of. You won't have to worry about anything anymore. Your grandson has made sure of that." Darius' grandmother turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes flickered to Darius, then back to the man. She didn't seem surprised. But then again, she never had been the type to show much emotion. "Who are you?" Darius asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with an edge of warning. The man turned slowly, a smile curling on his lips. It wasn't a kind smile, but one that seemed to recognize something about Darius, something that made him pause, just for a moment. "Ah, the young man returns," he said, his tone laced with amusement. "You must be Darius." Darius nodded, his muscles tensed, ready to react if he needed to. His grandmother was still silent, her gaze fixed on the man. It was as if she were waiting for something, but Darius couldn't tell what. The man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm here because of your grandfather's generosity," he said, his voice dripping with something else. "Your grandmother is in good hands. But there are other things to consider, Darius. Things that we need to talk about." "What do you mean?" Darius demanded, his voice rising with a mixture of confusion and fear. He didn't like this man. There was something in the way he spoke, something in his eyes that unsettled him. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Let me make it clear, Darius. The help your family has received, it's not charity. It's an investment. Darius' stomach sank. The word, investment, felt like a blade, slipping into his ribs. An investment in what? Darius asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but the doubt was thick in his words. The man's smile widened slightly, though it was devoid of warmth. In you, he said simply, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. You saved my daughter's life. And because of that, I've taken a keen interest in you. In your potential. But I don't help people out of the goodness of my heart. I don't give without expecting something in return. Darius stared at him, his heart thudding in his chest. The unease he had felt since the moment the promise was made surged to the forefront now, crashing through his thoughts like a wave. This wasn't a simple exchange of help for gratitude. This wasn't charity. This was something else, something he wasn't prepared for. What do you want from me? Darius asked, his voice barely a whisper now, his throat tight with fear and suspicion. The man leaned in slightly, his eyes glinting with something sharp and calculating. I want you to work for me, Darius. I want you to be a part of my business. I want you to learn the ways of the world, to learn how to be useful in a way that benefits both of us. In exchange, I will continue to take care of your grandmother's health, to ensure she receives everything she needs. But understand this, nothing in life is free. You owe me now. Darius felt the world tilt around him. His grandmother, who had always been his rock, was staring at him with those same unreadable eyes. Was she in on this too? Did she know what was happening? Why? Darius asked, his voice cracking with the weight of the question. Why me? Why now? The man's smile turned into something more calculating, more dangerous. Because you're different, Darius. You have something special. I can see it in you. And now, I want you to make sure that you're useful to me. I'm giving you an opportunity, one you can't afford to turn down. Darius stood there, frozen. He could feel the weight of the envelope still in his pocket, the promise of help, but now it seemed to come with chains that he hadn't seen before. He had asked for help, for his grandmother, for a chance at something better, but now, that help felt like a trap. The man turned to leave, giving one last glance at Darius before stepping out the door. I'll be back in a few days, Darius. Think carefully about what I've said. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room fell into silence. Darius stood there, trying to process what had just happened. His grandmother had accepted something he hadn't understood, something that came with strings attached. He had wanted to save her, but now, he felt like he was trapped in a game he didn't know how to play. The tipping point. Darius barely slept that night. The image of the man's smile, sharp and calculating, lingered in his mind long after the door had closed behind him. The words still echoed in his head, each one slicing through the silence of the room. I want you to work for me. You owe me now. He tossed and turned in the small bed he had shared with his grandmother for as long as he could remember, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. The promise of help, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a trap. He had asked for something so simple, something that felt so right in the moment, a chance to ease his grandmother's suffering, but now, with each passing minute, the gravity of the situation weighed heavier on him. The nurse arrived the next morning as scheduled, but Darius couldn't focus. He could barely look her in the eye as she made her rounds, checking his grandmother's vitals and administering her medication. He knew she was just doing her job, but it was hard to ignore the nagging feeling that everything was changing in ways he didn't understand. How had they gone from struggling for survival to suddenly being caught in the web of someone like that man? The nurse finished her work quickly, and with a quiet nod to Darius, she left the apartment. Darius felt his chest tighten as the door clicked shut behind her. His grandmother had been resting peacefully, but now, the quiet was oppressive, suffocating. He knew what he had to do. Grandma, he said, his voice tentative as he sat down beside her. "We need to talk." His grandmother, still propped up on the couch, opened her eyes slowly. Her face was pale, the deep lines of her age and illness etched into her skin. But there was something else in her expression, something that made Darius pause before speaking again. It was the look of someone who had already come to terms with something that he wasn't ready to understand. "Darius," she said softly, her voice hoarse but steady. "I know what you're thinking. And I think I know what you're feeling." Darius blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" She sighed, a sound that seemed to carry all the weight of years of experience. "I've seen it before, you know. People like him. People who offer help, but only when they know they can get something in return." Darius felt the breath leave his lungs. He hadn't realized that his grandmother had been so aware of what was happening. He had assumed that she had accepted the help without question, but now it seemed that she had been just as wary as he was. "You knew about him?" Darius asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Not exactly," she replied, her eyes distant, "but I've been around long enough to know how the world works. There's always a catch, Darius. When someone has power, when someone can give you what you want, there's always a price." Darius swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. "What should we do, Grandma? What if? What if we can't get out of this? What if he has us trapped?" His grandmother gave him a small, knowing smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "We can't undo what's been done, Darius. But we can control how we respond. Don't let him think that you're weak, or that you'll bend to his will. If he wants something from you, make sure that he knows you won't just give it away. You're stronger than you think." The words gave Darius a small measure of comfort, but the unease in his gut remained. He had made a promise that had been fulfilled, but the cost was now clear, and it was staring him in the face. The man had said it himself, "You owe me now." But what did that really mean? That afternoon, the man's words seemed to echo louder than ever. It was as though they were following Darius wherever he went, haunting him with the knowledge that there was more to this deal than he had initially understood. Every time he sold drinks on the corner, he couldn't help but scan the crowd for signs of the man. Was he watching him? Was he already expecting something in return? Darius had heard stories about people who made deals with the powerful, stories of promises that came with hidden costs, stories of debts that could never be fully repaid. His grandmother had warned him about people like this, but he hadn't understood what she meant until now. This wasn't just about helping his grandmother anymore. This was about power, manipulation, and a dangerous game that he wasn't sure he could play. The next morning, Darius' worst fears began to take shape. It wasn't the man himself who appeared at the door, but a sleek black car that pulled up outside the apartment. Darius' pulse quickened as he watched from the window. The car door opened, and out stepped two men. Neither of them were the man who had promised help, but they carried an air of authority that sent a chill down Darius' spine. They were dressed in dark suits, their expressions hard and cold. The world outside the window seemed to fade as Darius' thoughts raced. What were they here for? Why now? Without thinking, Darius quickly stepped away from the window and walked into the other room, trying to calm his racing heart. His grandmother was still resting, but he knew that whatever was happening outside was no accident. The air felt thick with tension, and Darius could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He didn't want to face them. Not yet. He wasn't ready for whatever this was going to be. But there was no avoiding it. As he turned to head back toward the door, he heard a knock. It was sharp, firm, and demanding. Darius froze for a moment, his heart thudding in his chest. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door, trying to mask the fear that threatened to overtake him. The men didn't speak immediately. They just looked at him, their eyes cold and unblinking. One of them was holding a briefcase, the other simply stood with his arms crossed, his eyes scanning Darius like a predator sizing up its prey. "Darius," the first man said finally, his voice deep and emotionless. "We need to talk." Darius opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. The man with the briefcase stepped forward, holding it out toward Darius. "This is for you," he said simply. "We were instructed to deliver it." Darius hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the briefcase. He knew this wasn't a gift. This wasn't a simple gesture of kindness. This was the cost, the price for his grandmother's health, for the help they had received. The man's eyes locked onto Darius with a cold, calculating look. "Your debt is now due, Darius. Open the briefcase." Darius' hands shook as he took the briefcase from the man. He knew he couldn't escape this. Not now. Not after everything that had already happened. But what would be inside? What did they want from him? The moment his fingers clicked the latch and opened the case, Darius found himself staring at a stack of photographs of him, of his grandmother, of their apartment. There were more than a dozen pictures, all taken at different times, showing every corner of their life, every detail of their world. It was as if they were being watched. "Your grandmother's care will continue," the man said, his voice low, "but understand this, Darius. There are expectations. And if you fail to meet them, everything will change." Darius' heart pounded in his chest. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. The man's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "You'll find out soon enough." The breaking point. Darius didn't sleep that night. How could he? The images of the photographs in the briefcase kept flashing in his mind. They were haunting not just because of what they showed, his grandmother in her fragile state, the cramped apartment, the way his life had been under constant surveillance, but because of the quiet, undeniable message that accompanied them. "You are being watched." The man's cold, calculated words echoed in his mind like a dark chant. "Your debt is now due, Darius. If you fail to meet expectations, everything will change." What did that mean? What were they expecting from him? He had saved a life, helped a girl. He had only asked for help in return, something simple. But now it felt like he had stepped into a nightmare, one where every move he made would come with consequences he didn't fully understand. The weight of the briefcase had felt like a physical thing, a burden pressing down on his chest. The photographs weren't just pictures, they were threats, silent but heavy, warning him of the price of his request. By the time the sun began to rise, Darius was sitting at the small, worn kitchen table, his head in his hands. The light creeping through the window seemed to mock him, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, like ghosts of the decisions he had made. He had wanted to do the right thing. He had wanted to protect his grandmother, to save her from suffering. But what if he had made a terrible mistake? What if this was all part of a bigger game, one where he had no power? The sounds of the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant noise of the street outside, felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's world. He was here, but he wasn't here. His mind was a whirl of confusion, fear, and guilt. His grandmother was still sleeping, thankfully unaware of the photographs, the briefcase, the men who had come to their door. She had been sick for so long, and Darius had tried so hard to shield her from the harshness of life. But now, he felt like the very thing he had been protecting her from was closing in on them. He stood up abruptly, a surge of energy flooding his body. He couldn't sit still anymore. He had to do something. He had to find a way out of this. If he stayed here, in this apartment, just waiting for the man to return, waiting for whatever demand was next, he would lose himself. He would lose everything. And if there was one thing Darius couldn't bear, it was the thought of losing his grandmother. She had already given so much for him, raised him, cared for him when no one else had. He couldn't let her down. His thoughts shifted back to the man, the one who had made the deal. The man who had come into their lives with promises that felt too good to be true. Darius remembered his smile, the way it never quite reached his eyes. There had been something hollow in that smile, something that made Darius feel like a pawn in a game he hadn't even known was being played. But now that Darius had been dragged into it, he needed to figure out the rules. Suddenly, an idea began to form. Maybe there was a way to turn this around. He couldn't escape the man's watchful eye, but he could still keep control of his own fate. He had already been pushed into this corner, but maybe, just maybe, he could fight back. That afternoon, Darius left the apartment, walking down the street with purpose. His grandmother had insisted that he take a break, that he go out and enjoy the day. She was always encouraging him to do something for himself, to forget about the constant struggle for just a little while. But today, Darius couldn't afford that luxury. He had to do something, and he couldn't do it alone. He made his way to a small, run-down cafe near the corner of the block, a place he had frequented in the past when he needed a quiet moment to think. It wasn't much, just a few mismatched tables and chairs, a couple of tired-looking customers hunched over their cups of coffee. But it was a place where Darius could feel like he wasn't being watched, even for a short while. The owner, an older woman with a friendly face and a soft voice, gave him a nod when he entered. Darius had always liked her, she had never treated him like a nuisance, unlike so many others in the neighborhood. "How's your grandmother doing, Darius?" she asked gently, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "I haven't seen you around in a few days." Darius paused, unsure of what to say. The truth seemed too much to share, too dangerous. How could he explain the situation to her? How could he explain the feeling of being trapped in a promise that seemed to have no end? Instead, he simply gave her a small smile. "She's okay," he said quietly. "Still the same, you know. But I'm doing what I can." The woman nodded knowingly, but she didn't press him further. She had seen too many young people struggling to make ends meet, too many faces like Darius. Her kindness was a small comfort, but Darius couldn't linger here for too long. He needed to keep moving. After he finished his coffee, Darius walked a few blocks to the other side of town, to a place he knew well but rarely visited. It was an old bookstore, one that smelled of dust and faded paper. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Carrington, had been a mentor of sorts to Darius when he was younger. He had always been a quiet man, with a sharp mind and a penchant for reading things no one else bothered to read. He had taught Darius how to think critically, how to question the world around him. It was something that had always stuck with him, and now, he needed it more than ever. When Darius stepped into the bookstore, the old bell above the door jingled. Mr. Carrington looked up from behind the counter, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw Darius. There was something in his gaze, something that made Darius feel both seen and understood. "Darius," Mr. Carrington said, his voice gravelly but warm. "It's been a while. What brings you here?" Darius hesitated, but then the words came rushing out. He told Mr. Carrington everything, the man who had helped his grandmother, the debt that was now owed, the photographs, the looming threat of whatever was coming next. "I don't know what to do, Mr. Carrington," Darius finished, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to help her. I thought maybe this time, things would be different. But now, I don't know. I feel like I'm in over my head." Mr. Carrington listened in silence, his face unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound in the store was the soft rustling of pages turning. Finally, he spoke. "You've made a decision, Darius," he said slowly. "You chose to act. And now you have to face the consequences of that decision. But that doesn't mean you're helpless. You're stronger than you think." Darius stared at him, his mind reeling. "But how do I fight back? How do I get out of this? Mr. Carrington gave a faint smile, but it was the kind of smile that suggested he had seen far more than Darius knew. The best way to fight back is to take control of your own story. Don't let anyone else write it for you. Darius didn't fully understand what Mr. Carrington meant, but something in those words clicked deep inside him. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to break free from this. Maybe the key wasn't to run or hide, but to face what was coming head-on and rewrite the terms of the deal. With renewed determination, Darius left the bookstore, his steps more purposeful than before. The darkness of his situation hadn't vanished, but he was no longer as afraid of it. He was ready to face whatever was next, ready to take control of the story that had been thrust upon him.